Welcome back to Evolve. Today, we have the honor of speaking with Noel, who is a research scholar at the London School of Economics and Political Science, the LSE, and we will be discussing her journey from Kerala to London. So thanks for coming here today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Noel. I'm a PhD scholar at the LSE. I'm actually here on the LAP scholarship, which is a scholarship by the UK government. And I sort of began my journey as studying social science broadly. And then I sort of moved into studying political science and international relations. And I'm currently in the history department here. And I'm broadly studying India's refugee policy in the 50s and 60s. So, yeah.
So you were born and raised in Kerala.
Mm-hmm.
What's the story of this student from Kerala to London now? Could you tell us the whole journey?
It's quite rare for students in India to in one sense opt social science as prospect in terms of career. Usually people go for sciences or they are in commerce. That's the predominant two options. You either become a doctor or you become an engineer in India. But then my mother, she's an English teacher. So I was always interested in languages and writing specifically. And throughout my school years, my mom always trained me to, one sense, take part in poetry or histrionics and just writing and literature in general. And so I had cultivated an interest in social science and essay writing and the like. And so initially when I took up social science, I really didn't know what I was getting into. But then I did that for my bachelor's early in Kerala. And usually the education system in Kerala, the early education is really good. Kerala is a 90% literate state. So the early education is really good, but then it's not as known for higher education. So I went to quite a small university in Kerala. And the aim for most students who are doing social science is to in one sense go to Delhi, which is where most of the higher education institutions, the best institutions in India, for instance, Stephens, or JNU, or the big institutions in India are. But then it's also India is a very big country. So if you, for instance, are from Kerala, it's pretty much Europe in the sense it's you're from one end to the other. It's quite, unless you have family who sort of move about, it's not really possible to think about how do you commute to in one sense go to Delhi and study, because you really don't know anybody and you're almost by yourself, and you'd be sort of the first person in your whole family to even go to that far state.
Wow.
But for my master's, so when I initially got the admission, my parents were very nervous. Okay, if we send her to Delhi, we don't know anybody, what's gonna happen, It's in one sense, it's my dad was very supportive during the early stages. He used to sort of take me to write all these entrance exams. And I think it's India is quite infamous for that. Everything is so competitive, and that's sort of the same with social sciences, where you write even for social sciences, for instance, I think here in the UK, most of it is qualitative writing, but I think with the social sciences in India, it's because just the number of students who are participating in the competition, it's you need to write 10 exams, you need to travel to 10 different cities to in one sense write those exams. And then so in the early stages, it's my dad was very supportive, and he was in one sense somebody who had a vision. It was okay, even if you do go to Delhi, it's we will in some means think about how you're going to support you. But then it's when I did go to Delhi, I actually found out there was actually a big community of students who were from different parts of India. And I studied in JNU. And JNU is the sort of university where, for instance, the fee was 238 rupees. It's two pounds by London standards. It's what do you say? For a whole semester, I paid 238 rupees. And that's really good. You get public education.
£2 for the whole semester?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. It's it's actually called Jawaharlal Nehru University. And so Nehru actually established that with the aim of, Nehru is very famous for, in one sense, establishing the IITs and having collaboration with all the other nation states like Russia, especially during that time, and technology transfer. But then he also was a visionary in the sense that he set up JNU, and most of the early diplomats in India were trained in JNU. The best historians in India were trained in JNU. So, but the good thing was that it's like I sort of went to JNU and I saw like students who were, from like very interior parts of India, like Jharkhand and Orissa. And like some of my very close friends were from, the Northeast states. Like many of the states' name I didn't even like know, even though I was like in social sciences, like before I went there. And then there were students whose parents were like from like very lower classes, like parents who were like drivers. And I think it was a very interesting sort of like a space to be in because you had to navigate a lot of cultural differences like language, class, caste, religion. And it sort of like in one sense was like a melting pot. And it was also like, I think, a visionary policy that the Indian state had to like in one sense cultivate like social sciences and actually experiment with the sort of principles that social sciences have, where it's like you have egalitarian opportunity and then you sort of like blend in and sort of build a culture for yourself. And I think it's like beginning in JNU, it's like I sort of in one sense got exposed to some of the best professors in history and like social sciences. And they had in one sense like education in like London. And it's from there that I sort of like got to know that, there were professors who actually worked on South Asia who were not necessarily just in India. And I think while doing that, doing the sort of pedagogy that JNU gave me, I sort of began applying for positions here in the UK. And I think it's like, it's very important to like, in one sense, also understand that the UK like has had like that history of a lot of students, like LSE is the sort of place where Ambedkar studied and he's like a Dalit intellectual. And you have Nehru and like, so it's like, in one sense, it's like the UK is sort of like a familiar space for like a lot of students who are like pursuing social sciences because all the professors who wrote the articles that you're like reading about, they are like somewhere here in the UK. And I think it's like when I was doing my bachelor's, even though it was like a small university, I remember one of the professors saying, this particular article is like published by somebody in like Yale. And you should, in one sense, think about how you can change pedagogy from the place that it's actually made. And I think it was quite interesting how he instilled that sort of like, I mean, it's unimaginable, like when you're like at that place to like actually for him to like say something like that. So I feel, yeah, in one sense, it's like coming to the LSE and having the opportunity to study. And in one sense, being supported like by the British government to do that, to like study South Asian history. It's like a full circle, like, yeah.
Just to go back to then when you were in Kerala, because even to go to Delhi, that was a big thing. So at that time, did you ever envision, was it a goal like, okay, I want to study at the LSE or I want to study in the UK? Or did that only come through your classes in
JNU?
Yeah.
I think it's like when I was, I actually did have like a good private education, like when I was in, Kerala. So I was like, it was not that I did not know that like people go out and study. But I feel it's just, I don't know anybody in my own social circle who sort of did that. And I think it's like, even with my generation, it's only now that a lot of South Asians actually have begun moving out. So I think when I began, I was thinking, oh my God, how will I? It was like a big struggle to even think about like becoming a professor in that small university because it was so competitive. And so like actually moving out of that place and then going to Delhi was, in one sense, when I look back, it was not something that I imagined was possible.
Throughout this journey, did you face any major challenges that particularly stand out to you? And if you did, how did you overcome them?
I think I face the sort of challenges that most students in India face, which is when you're like in a competitive environment, like how do you, in one sense, like study and like pass those exams and the sort of self-doubt that you have. I think being in India wasn't as hard. I think it's like when I, for instance, began applying to the LSE, like I mentioned, a lot of the professors that I sort of like read, like were like big people, like, it's like in my mind, they're like, oh, they're like at LSE and they are so and so intellectual sort of a thing. So in your mind, you have like this giant side of, sort of a thing in your mind and you think it's like it's really impossible to like reach out. And a lot of Indian students initially when they start like pursuing research, the fact is research in one sense also like works through those networks. You in one sense like contribute to existing gaps in literature. So you need to like reach out to people who are doing that research to then tell them, oh, I'm actually working in this area and then I can like fill this particular gap. So I think it's like one of the biggest challenges that I faced was to actually like begin reaching out and actually have the confidence to think, oh, it's like I can actually contribute to like this particular gap. And I think for a lot of students from like developing countries, that's one of the big challenges. Another would probably be that education, like the access is like quite expensive. So, if you want to sort of apply for like LSE PhD, it's almost 10,000 rupees when I was like in India. And as like, I was working as like a research scholar there. And then like my month's salary was like 30,000. So it would be like almost 1/3 of that I need to like put into applying. And then I wouldn't have any assurance as to whether or not the application will like get through, because
that's just for the application itself.
Yeah. The application itself is like so expensive.
Yeah.
So I feel it's like, I think there's the factor of like, there's the personal thing of whether like if you're from sort of like a developing country, you don't have the confidence to like think, oh, like, can I contribute to that? Like if you do like cross that barrier, then there's also the question of like, do you actually have the money to apply or like try? Because it's also a question of chance. You can do like 10 applications and they could be to like universities, and that particular university in that particular year is not hiring someone with regards to the specific topic, or that professor who's like an expert in that area is not taking students that year. So then it's like you need to maybe apply for like 20 to 30 universities, and that's like a lot of money. For somebody in social sciences, that might amount to like almost like a year of like your savings to like apply for that. Yeah. So I think that's that, like the money aspect of it is like a big deal. And then it's not like, for instance, even if you do get like a PhD, it's not necessary it's like funded. So there's that additional challenge. You need to like find funding in the UK. But it's also like a question of like persistence, I guess. It's like, I know a lot of students who, for instance, applied and did not get like the first year, and they applied the second year, they got it, but they didn't get funding. And then they applied the third year, and then it's like that didn't happen. And it's like, even within my cohort, I know like people who applied for like 4 years and then finally got it. Like, so I think it's like a question of persistence, at least at like a PhD level. Like if, for instance, you don't have the money to like fund yourself like in London, but you sort of want scholarship, you want the sort of education that London provides you with. I think if you're like in one sense persistent, like it's possible to like do that.
How did you eventually overcome the challenge of reaching out to those professors that you mentioned before?
I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that during the time that I began applying, a lot of South Asians actually began doing that. Like, I think it's like in the last 5 years or so, there's like a huge community of South Asians who have in one sense like moved to the UK and are thinking about it. And so for me, I think it's like I spoke to some of them and they were like very encouraging. And I remember one of my closest friends, like he and his wife, like they were moving here to London, and they actually came home and then they convinced my parents that, you should like let her apply for the same. So I think it's a lot of the sort of support systems that you have, and the fact that people around you have actually tried it, and it's like, it's not like that far, it's actually possible to do something like that. Yeah.
You highlighted some really deep points there, I think, about how important visibility is in terms of seeing people like you who've also made it and completed, I guess, the goals that you'd like to do. For me, it was as simple as I finished my year abroad, and there were classmates who didn't do a year abroad at my undergraduate university, Queen Mary. And about 4 or 5 of them all said to me, oh, we're going to do a master's at the LSE next year. And up until that moment, I'd never considered it, but only when I'd seen my own classmates say like, yeah, we're going to do it. I thought, okay, like something in my brain was just like, I can do this now.
Yeah.
So I think, that's so important. Maybe I don't know if you've got any message to someone else in that position who doesn't have to be Kerala, doesn't have to be India, but someone who may be from a background where it's not always as visible. What advice or kind of support would you give to someone, or even to yourself, in the past who didn't necessarily at that time see other people like you in that position?
I think it's like one of the first things I sort of did was to reach out to students who were doing their PhDs. I would sort of like write to them. And the surprising thing is that almost everybody would actually respond. I would sort of ask, I would write to them and then ask them, you sort of need to know like what the trends are within that particular department, who is who, like in terms of like an expert before you sort of apply. So I think one of the first things that I did was to like actually write to like some of the students. And I still have a lot of students who apply abroad who sort of like write to me. And if they do, it's like I make sure that it's like I sort of set up like a video call and then tell them this professor does this. And maybe, you need to improve like your proposal in this way. So in the early years, there were like people within my own, would you say, circle who sort of helped me. But then there were also like random strangers, who just had like a profile on their website of whatever university they were at. I would sort of like write to them. I would first like read what their research was about, but then I would sort of reach out to them and then ask them, how do I improve my proposal? Could you give me some insights? And there were a lot of people who were doing that during that particular time. And I feel that's the same. You sort of do that, and then you can then maybe start, once you get like a bit of a confidence, then you start like reaching out to professors and you get insights from these students. And then you can maybe then start like reaching out to professors. And I feel if people don't respond, there's no need to like take it personally. Like, people, there are like 10 things going on in like people's lives and maybe they didn't respond because of whatever reason. But usually people are, when you approach people, they sort of like respond. And then I think it's like you need to keep, talking to like multiple people. I think I almost wrote to like 30 to like 35 professors. And then there were a lot of people who did not like respond to me. And then there were some professors who sort of told me that they couldn't take any students this year. And then they mentioned other professors. And then I sort of wrote to other professors. So I feel, I think actually 30 is like a very small number. People actually like write to a lot more. So I think students need to like keep doing that, because oftentimes with research, at least like social science research, it's also, you can mold your topic in terms of like methodology or like in terms of how you fit into like the gaps, depending on whether or not like a professor is interested in your topic. So I'm talking about like a very niche, like I think there aren't as many students who are in one sense trying to pursue like a PhD or in like social sciences. If there's somebody like that listening to me in the podcast, I think it's like the point is to like apply widely, reach out to people widely, talk to them. And then in one sense, it becomes sort of relatable. And then you think it's actually possible to do. So.
For sure. I would say like it's such a valuable point there. And again, with the universities as well, like it is a numbers game.
Yeah.
Because if you try and take it like with an impersonal approach.
Yeah.
And they don't reply to me, no problem at all. I mean, it's difficult at the start. When you first do it, you take it every single one personally, like, no, they don't like me or whatever. When, to be honest, your email might not have even appeared in their inbox, right? So many things get filtered out.
Yeah.
But by doing that over and over again, you will definitely get at least one or two applications. And while the universities, as you mentioned, do cost money to apply to, an email's free. And the value of just taking one extra minute or 2 extra minutes to actually write a message that's not so generic of just, hi, can I talk to you? Like, okay, that might not, but it's, hi, I've read your research and it really inspired me, particularly this intricate part. Then you're going to stand out to people, because I always say like academics, they're kind of like bodybuilders. They have the stage where they're flexing their muscles. They're academic, it's their publications. So if you've read a bit of their publication and found something and that resonated with you, you're way more likely to get a reply.
I think you summed it better.
No, I mean, you literally, it's such a great example of that.
Just based on that, you mentioned research, and I almost feel like there's some kind of imaginary Venn diagram, right? Where you have your interests in one circle and the other side you have the actual research that is being conducted, because of course it needs to be paid for, right? And people don't pay for all kind of research. So how did you go about deciding what kind of research you wanted to do? Was it solely based on passion, or did you have to compromise at some stage?
I think there were there are even now there are two options. Like I think even within social science research and like science research as well, there are funded PhDs that are already like a project. And if you, for instance, have a certain set of skills, you can usually fit into the project. And then it's like you don't really need to go about finding funding. But then I think if you have your own project, you usually need to like, in one sense, find your own funding. And for that, I think one of the things, especially in social science research, would be to like articulate how your research. I'm in the history department. The assumption is like if you do something in history, it's not going to be like relevant for like future. But nonetheless, it's sort of like very important to like place like your research within like a contemporary context and like how it's going to be like relevant in terms of like policy implications. And if, for instance, the funding, I mean, it's a competition at the end. So if they think it's like one of the criteria is that if it's going to like in one sense translate into like policy, the likelihood of you getting like funding is more. I think because I work on like citizenship in India, and that was like a time in which it was like widely discussed. I was also lucky, like I was passionate about this, and that topic was sort of in trend at that particular point in time. So I got the funding. But at the same time, there's also factors of having like a good methodology. If you have like a very strong method, and with social science, for instance, if you've done prior research, if you have like a few publications already, like all of this in one sense like strengthens like your project. But then, like you mentioned, there's already projects that are pre-funded and that exist. And if, for instance, you're able to place yourself as having certain skills, and if you're able to like position yourself, how you'll contribute to that broader research, that's also one way in which it's like you can pursue research. Yeah, but this, yeah.
And to go back to like kind of Indian or maybe South Asian context, in terms of the culture in Kerala, maybe there are some of the audience who don't really know much about it. Is the environment supportive for sending family members to other cities, especially for women as well? What was it like growing up there, and how did that culture tie into this whole journey?
I think it's Kerala is like comparatively like a pretty, what do you say, educated state, and it's a sort of state in which like people actually pursue like social science research as compared to like other states. But I also feel Kerala is like extremely diverse. You have, what do you say, a significant Christian, Muslim, and Hindu population. And usually, if you do study in a public school, I think most of your classmates will pretty much be from like different faiths. But that was not really the case with me. I think I studied like in a minority institution. So from like the longest time, I studied with students who were like Christians, and I didn't really know that many people who were, what do you say, like Muslim or like Hindu, even though I'm like in the most, what do you say, pluralistic state within India. So I think, so when I moved from like a private to like a public education system, and also like in the private school, it's like you have Christians, and then they're of a certain class. So I just knew everybody. I thought this was what the world looked like. And then I sort of moved to like Delhi, and then suddenly I'm like in one sense exposed to so many different languages and cultures. I think I cannot speak for everyone. I don't know how it is with all Malayali families. But I do think there is a huge population within India. People actually do migrate for like education, and that's quite common in India. People do go to like Delhi, people go to like different, because you have like a common entrance exam and for most of the subjects, and oftentimes you don't really have a choice of where you're like allotted to. And that's the case with like science research as well. So you write the national entrance, and then it's like the universities have like different rankings, and oftentimes it's like you're sort of put into like a completely like different place. And so I think Indian students, in one sense, if for instance their family is supportive of education, they are quite accustomed to like being put in like a different state where they probably don't know the language or like, yeah, like the culture of that particular place, of students sort of like moving about. Yeah, so I think it's not like a very unusual thing for like students to do that. But then it always helps in one sense if, for instance, you have family in like different parts of the country and they are in one sense able to like support you. I think once I studied in Delhi, I think my family also had the confidence that I could like survive like by myself. And then I think it's like there was no question for my parents of thinking, oh, how is she going to survive in like any other part of the country? Because you did that once and then you know that this is something that other students are doing. Yeah, I think it's a question of, your parents being able to like know that your daughter's not alone in doing this. There's like thousands of students who are like doing this, and then she's one among them. And then there's like ways in which it's like you can build your community wherever you go. So, yeah.
So in your case, the family was always supportive, or was there any kind of resistance of like, no, it might be dangerous, it's far away, or any kind of things like that?
No, I think it's like my family was supportive because it's like they were very keen on education. Like there was the idea that education is what's going to get you out of whatever situation you are in. So there was a prioritization of education. But then there's also the fact of what can they do, like if something happens to you, like in Delhi, and Delhi is not like the most safe, like at least when you're from Kerala, it's not really known as the most safest city like in India, and it's so far away. I think there was one instance in which I got like jaundice, and then it's like, what do you say? My parents were like, they didn't know what to do because it's like, it's like so far away and they just can't come in like all on a sudden and stuff. So there's questions of like health and stuff, but mostly they were supportive. And I think it's like for most families for whom education is like a priority, that is likely to be the case. I don't think there was like a gendered thing, at least in my family. I'm not sure that's the case with like the majority of Indians. But then I do think, at least like with my generation, if both the parents are like in one sense educated, gender doesn't play as much a big role as probably maybe like 20 years ago, like 30 years ago. Yeah.
And for someone who has not much, I know that Kerala's in the south and Delhi's in the north, but how far actually is it in terms of like distance? Like to drive or to, I don't know, how do you travel there?
I don't think you can drive. Like it's like, what do you say? It's a 3-day train journey.
Oh, wow.
Like,
3 days. And I complain about 90 minutes to go from London to Kent.
I never heard of anybody like driving from like, what do you say? I think then you be in like some major, I don't know, Guinness World, like,
Wow.
It's like you're trying to like set up some record, like all India travel. That's when you do something like that. Like nobody drives. From, like,
so you take the train for 3 days to get?
No, I think it's like, I think I did that once, but then like, what do you say? Like I used to like fly into like, I think the first time I went, my dad actually took me on the train. Yeah, because it's like, on the flights, you can't take like the big suitcases and stuff. But otherwise it's like, but then it was also like once in a year thing, I couldn't come as often. Like I would do that like once in a year.
So then the next jump from obviously moving to Delhi, Hyderabad, Chennai, then how was that in terms of, okay, you're all at least in the same country to then say, I'm going to go abroad.
Yeah.
I mean, you've had the dream, but then it's actually becoming a reality now.
Yeah.
How did that step go? And in terms of like, okay, you're now an Indian lady in London.
Yeah.
I have no idea what that's like. Could you give us an insight into that, please?
Yeah, I think like, because for my family, I think it's like London was quite like an unfamiliar place. Like we didn't really know like that many people. I think once I came to London, then there were like some third cousin, like, once you come there, then you find out, oh, you actually do have like family that's like third cousin, and they sort of like, in one sense, like help you. But then before like coming to London, it was actually like a big leap. But I feel in one sense, it's like having negotiated like the differences in like culture once I actually moved to like Delhi, it was like a lot more easier in one sense to like move to London, because it was just another place in which it's like I had to communicate with like different people. But I was also very intrigued about like people who sort of were born and brought up here, who, for instance, had like schoolmates who were from, I don't know, like all sorts of different countries that you sort of like learn in geography. Like, I had to like study, this is like the list of things like Somalia, like this is like this country. And then it's like, if you grew up in London, you probably have like the privilege to actually have these people as like your neighbors. And then you go to the, shops and stuff. It's like, you don't really need to like take the sort of effort to like, in one sense, acculture yourself. So I think it's like, in one sense, like a very good opportunity. It's like a city in which it's like there's every kind of person here. So I think moving to London in terms of like thinking about, oh, how will I get the scholarship? How will I, in one sense, like connect to like the professor was like a bit of a big deal. But I didn't really think about how will I fit into the city, because I always knew it was like a multicultural city. And it's like a city of like a lot of opportunity, and everybody is like quite open-minded here. So yeah, I think it's like that was not as big like as a transition, I feel.
Interesting that from a city to city in India seems like it was more of a jump and a transition from...
Yeah, I think it's also like my personal experience. I think it's like, if for instance you were coming from like Delhi, then to maybe move to like London would have been like a big deal. Like, but I think for me, like I think Kerala to like moving to Delhi was like a bigger, a bigger transition. Yeah.
And you mentioned language before as well. So at home, would you speak Malayalam? How would it work linguistically in Kerala? Because it's a very diverse place as well in terms of like learning the different languages that you speak.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
So I think it's like most Malayalis, like they speak Malayalam at home, but then usually, I mean, my mom's like an English teacher, so you at school you speak English, and then you have
only English, or
like there's I mean, I think it's like the colonial past kind of thing, where it's like English is like emphasized, and you're like in one sense like punished if you don't like speak in English. Yeah. So there's like that's sort of like a funny thing. But then it's also, I feel Indians have like mastered English to the extent that it's actually become like the way in which you communicate with each other across like the whole of India. Because if, for instance, you take Hindi, there's no consensus in the South. People in the South are like, oh, you cannot impose Hindi. But then it's like the way people in the South communicate to people in the North is with English. So in one sense, it's like the language that connects all of India, like North, South, Northeast, like the West. We primarily spoke Malayalam and like maybe English at school, but then we also had like the third language, so you had to like learn Hindi. And I also like studied a bit in like Tamil Nadu, so like Tamil as well. So I think it's like if you're born in India, you usually do know like a lot of languages, because most of the time Indians are in one sense, in your neighbors might be like Tamil, or like you have like some sort of Hindi friend, and so it's like in one sense, and you watch a lot of Bollywood. So yeah, Indians do know like a lot of languages just because you live in India. Like that's quite common.
It's fascinating that to compare in an English context, we just really learn English here, but from a very young age, you're learning to adapt to all of these different languages at the same time. So then coming to London for someone who's already had to switch.
I'm just really curious to know what your experience in London has been like overall for you. Like, has it been nice? Have you had a good time?
I think I'm really happy to be like in London. I'm like, I really feel this is in one sense, like it is a metropolitan, like a global metropolitan city. And like, maybe I can compare it to like New York. Like other than that, I don't really think there's anywhere in the world that you find this sort of like a cultural amalgamation. But then I also feel like, my experience in London is also like as a PhD student. I feel it's like if I came in here as a master's student, I would have had like a much more diverse experience. But when you do a PhD in the UK, you're pretty much by yourself. So you just like dropped in like this country, and you sort of go to the archives, you go to like the library. You don't have classes, so you don't like meet your cohort hardly. You meet your cohort like maybe once or twice like in a month, and you like the cohort needs to like really struggle to like like get that, because PhD students in one sense are also like sort of like shy, and they don't usually like ever initiate any social gathering. And like, so I think initially it was a lot harder, but then because I sort of studied in like a university space, I think it would have been like a different space. For instance, if you study in like Cambridge or Oxford, which are like universities, and you're like in London, and your cohort and like the whole of LSE is like dispersed across like the whole city. So in one sense, it's like there's that aspect of like loneliness that you need to like deal with. And that doesn't have anything to do with London as a city. That's just like PhD as a, as a program. It's like quite lonely. So then what I had to do was to like actually take initiative, not be like shy and then like approach people. I think it's like almost 60% of like LSE students are like not necessarily like British. They are like overseas students. And in my cohort, for instance, there's just one British guy, and everybody else is from like, like everybody else is from like a different place, and they have their own research and expertise to like go through. So I feel, I feel very lucky to, like, in one sense, be in London. I really love this city.
I think London is super diverse. It's super diverse. So
Yes.
it's not surprising, you know?
When you mentioned about mastering English,
Yeah.
I think for those who don't necessarily know about history and why Indians speak English, they may be a bit surprised that even for me, I've got South Asian heritage as well. The best mastery I ever saw of the English language was in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
It was at the LSE, but it was during a debate between the Indian Society and the Pakistani Society of the LSE. And it was basically a debate about whether or not partition was a good thing or not.
Okay.
So, but it was in good nature, like in good spirits.
Yeah.
But I remember as a British Asian watching the language used by these students, and for the first time feeling really insecure about my own English because I was just like, I was Googling the words they were using on my phone, like the dictionary. But I mean, for those who don't know, like what is the approach to learning English? How do like South Asians, especially Indians, get to such a high level of English while also becoming fluent in like 3 or 4 other languages at the same time?
It's quite like dispersed. Like depending on which state you're from, like each state has its like own policy in terms of what the public education needs to be. So if you're usually private educated in India, like you usually speak like really good English because there's, you follow something called as a CBSE Board of Education. And then like that sort of in one sense is like prioritizes English education. And that's not necessarily the case with like all the states within India. I mean, we would study like Hamlet and Macbeth. And for instance, like my mom's like an English teacher, and then it's like we would do like histrionics, and then it's like do like Martin Luther King and stuff.
Wow.
So in one sense, like read Daffodils. So you know all of this, like the sort of architecture that the British sort of like had in terms of like the culture. So you know everything about like Victorian culture. You know like Jane Eyre, and then it's like you come here and then all of these houses of all these literary figures that you in one sense like read like in India. So I feel the education in India is still broadly like based on the British model, and then Indians in one sense like mastered that. You don't really feel odd like studying like Daffodils. Like there's no like that context doesn't exist in like India, but still you in one sense like learn about things that you're not really familiar with and still like make it like your own. I think it's like Indians. And I think like most of the colonies in one sense have like mastered that art. Like, you sort of like imitate something to the point it's like you're actually like really good at it. I think that's the case. But I don't think it's like uniform. I don't think it's like access to that education is there for everybody. But still, I mean, for the number of Indians, I think it's like a lot of Indians do like know a lot about English literature and like English language a lot more than sometimes even like British people.
I mean, literally you read my mind, and I kind of chuckled, but it's an embarrassing laugh that I did earlier because you're making me realize that these things you've studied and the architecture and the buildings, like I have no idea about those things. And you are on the other side of the world. I mean, it's on the one hand, like there's a, I guess, unsettling side of history, but at the same time, just from a purely academic perspective, it is very impressive. But you also touched on another sensitive area that there is like inequalities here in terms of the access to that education.
Yeah.
And the English language is especially significant in terms of accessibility to education, right? You have to do the IELTS test to get in.
Yeah.
If you were from that background and had access to private education, you're going to get your English level is better than I would say 99% of people who are born and raised in the UK, but that might not be the case for someone else. So I mean, now that you've been through the system, do you have any pointers for someone who maybe doesn't have that access? Because I feel like this is a very different conversation for someone who doesn't necessarily have all of those advantages in terms of the language yet, in terms of the means necessarily. And I guess in your time at, is it JNU?
Yeah, JNU,
Yeah, so in your time at JNU, you said you were around a lot of different types of people from various backgrounds. So could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, I do know a lot of people who, for instance, were not like privately educated. And so like English was not the language in which they did their formative schooling. So then there was like a lot of investment that they had to like make in terms of, learning the language. But then I do know a lot of people who actually did make that transition. And I think it's like if you do make that transition, survival and like social science research is like, it gives you like so much more opportunities, because I do know people who did, for instance, like a bachelor's in like Malayalam, like not even, would you say, like their early primary education. I know people who did their bachelor's in like Malayalam and then sort of like moved into JNU. And I think it's the system in JNU where you have, what do you say, preferences, you have quotas based on language as well. So it's a system that fits into that. But then they sort of make that transition once they come there. And then there's that extra effort that they sort of put in. But that transition, once they do make that transition, the good thing is, I feel there's a sort of knowledge that people of, what do you say, like different languages have, that in one sense, like sort of like is completely like forgotten, because, you know, there's no access to that in terms of like English. And they sort of bring in the sort of knowledge that particular, there's like certain debates that happen in that particular language, and they're able to like bring that out into English. And then that's kind of then discussed broadly amongst people who don't necessarily just speak that language, but then it's like it's available for like everybody who speaks that language. So I feel in one sense, it's like, it's that effort, that extra effort that students need to like make. But then it's actually like possible, because I do know like a lot of people who did that. And once they do that, then the access is also like a lot more. I think it's like there's a Dalit scholar in India who says English is the emancipatory language in India now. So, you know, it's like if you do know that, you do have like the power, like you can speak across like different communities in India, and you can speak to like a broader audience. So yeah, I think it's like, yeah, education in India needs to, in one sense, like emphasize English education.
Oh, I really felt that. That's a powerful, powerful statement for a variety of deep, layered reasons. Obviously, it's not entirely comparable, but even for me, I went to a grammar school in the UK, and when I got to the LSE, I noticed a significant, like it was very, very evident that over 90%, like pretty much everyone I met had gone to a private school. Of course, the level of that relatively compared to some of the people we've mentioned may not be as significant, but still, even the way that people were speaking compared to where I went to school and in my hometown was very different in English to most of the students at the LSE. And we do come across like, when speaking among other Brits, there's a consensus that if someone's from a developing country and they're at the LSE or even in the UN, you would almost assume like, wow, this person's probably from a very wealthy background. It is a thing also when it comes to employability, international organizations, that it's like people, of course, are trying to bring in people from different backgrounds, but it's hard because even to do a UN internship, that's unpaid. For a lot of people to go to New York or Geneva or Bangkok for 6 months without receiving any sort of compensation, that's really, really difficult, especially when you do the conversion rate from even from pounds to dollars in New York, let alone from rupees. So yeah, I think it is really something that needs to be spoken about more. The disparities there at these top institutions. You might see people from Pakistan or India, but yeah, I really like that we can break it down and try and encourage people, no matter what their background is, that it might be more difficult for you at the start. Like you said, you might have done a bachelor's degree in another language. It won't be a level playing field necessarily at the start, but if you keep persevering, you will be able to do it. And it's so nice to hear those stories for people who have done it. So you can realize, okay, like this might be more difficult for me. Even from a UK context, people from a state school, a non-private school, getting into a university like the LSE can be very daunting just because you get to somewhere and everyone's speaking differently. So yeah, it's a challenge for sure, but you should always persevere and believe that with the right willpower, it's going to be difficult. You might have to reach out to so many people, but that one email, that one scholarship eventually could change your entire life.
I do also think it's like once you do get access, for instance, it's like I'm actually teaching like undergrad students right now at LSE, and I see the kind of training that they get, and it's like it's so different from, for instance, the sort of training that I got when I was like in India, for like even in the best institutions like in India. So I feel, for instance, it's like students have like lectures, and then it's like I sort of do the seminars. and that's more, concentrated. There's just 15 students. And then I sort of like follow up with like each student, like with the sort of formative essays they write. I comment on like each of, and that's not the sort of like, even in the best education institutions in India, you don't get that sort of training. So I feel it's very important in one sense to like pursue like that sort of possibility or like opportunity, because the training that you get from the best institutions in one sense is actually like worth that. Because if, for instance, you do get that sort of mentoring at like an earlier stage, it's like, I think the progress that you make over time is going to be like quite substantial as compared to like, for instance, if you do not have that sort of like a support system like early on. So yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, it's like, I do know that most of the students who I teach are like privately educated, but then yeah, like in terms of class, I feel it's like LSE is like a lot less diverse than like some of the experiences that I've had like in India. And I feel it's like the students union in LSE is something like it is attempting to like, like deal with that. But then I feel these are like big questions. These are questions about like funding. These are questions about like how educational institutions like abroad work. And I think these are questions in one sense that the British themselves need to like answer, because it's like, I mean, if for instance, the best institutions in like Britain like cater to like a certain class, then like the British need to like ask like, like who gets access to that, because anybody who does get access to that, like their progress in terms of career is like multiplied. So yeah, I think it's like an important question. And I feel especially in the UK, it's something that the British population needs to like actually like actively think about. Yeah.
For sure. I mean, to comment on that, in theory, any British citizen can apply for a student loan.
Yeah.
So that can cover the fees of the degree. And to an extent, you may get like a maintenance loan, I think they call it, where you get a grant to pay for accommodation, which in London probably won't be enough for someone to survive on. So on paper, it's feasible. However, in reality, the fact that at an institution like the LSE, it is so dominated by privately educated people. When you dig deeper, what you mentioned about the extra support those students at the LSE get, like your students, I noticed by comparing and discussing with friends of mine who went to private schools, just the amount of attention they got to university applications. If I compare with the grammar school I attended, a classmate of mine who approached the careers advisors and really wanted to apply to the Ivy League, straight A student. And his response from the careers advisory team at the grammar school was, you'll never get in there. There's no point trying. Whereas some of my friends in the local private school could attend the weekly Ivy School club after school, where they had a designated team, where 30% of the students each year, up to 30%, would go into Oxbridge. Whereas if we got one kid from our year who got to Oxbridge, it was like a huge celebration. So it's these subtle things that training from a young age, that if you aren't from one of those institutions, it's an unfair reality that I guess you would have to accept. But by preparing yourself, doing your research, finding out about the applications process, you have to be extremely diligent and go off and do a lot of your own work, reach out to people for advice. But it is possible. It's just more difficult at the start. But once you're in, that coaching is for sure. It's so valuable. And that's why part of the reasons why the employability from these top universities is so high as well. Rather than, it's obviously name and prestige plays a significant role, but just the training you get, even like there's a confidence you get because people from these top companies, I remember while I was at the LSE, spokespeople, like people from the UN came and they gave a talk telling us how to apply and what to put. And I still remember that one of the things that I put on my application to the UN was make sure that at the first line you put, thank you very much for reviewing my application, or thank you very much for taking the time to consider my application. And this careers advisor lady from the UN told us that if she saw an application without a thank you at the start, because it was so competitive, they wouldn't even consider it. So little things like that, I knew that, and I had the benefits because I had classmates from the UN and I had these people coming to give us talks. If you haven't got those opportunities, again, you're definitely at a disadvantage there.
Yeah. But I do think it's like it's like a personal thing about like persevering. But I also feel it's like it's much more like a bigger question of like policy. Would you say? I think it's like citizens do need to like then ask their governments about what do you say? We need like better education systems, like, and that need not necessarily be because it's like my parents were like engineers or like doctors, so then they could afford to like send them to like private school, and then that gets multiplied like over generations. So I feel it's like, I think citizens like generally need to like then ask the government to like invest in like education, and so that'll like in one sense actually create like a equal playing ground, and then like, and it's not like multiplied, that sort of inequality that it's like that small seminar that you got to like attend that multiplies into like what you get, like how do you get like a master's education. So I feel it's like there's the question of like individuals persevering. And there are like so many stories of like people, getting through that. But then it's also like a big policy questions that I think actively citizens need to ask their governments to like invest in education that's like broadly egalitarian.
Could you comment a little bit on networking? Because I know it's a huge facet of actually going to one of these top institutions. Of course, the training is one of them.
Yeah.
Networking, as Hakeem has alluded to, is another huge one.
Yeah, I think it's like networking within, I think research is quite like different from, I think it's like if, for instance, you were networking within LSE as like a master's student and you're like trying to like get a job within like, for instance, like one of the corporations. I think it's like Hakeem had already mentioned how it's like usually you like do approach like a scholar by like reading like their work and then pointing to like, this is a sort of like an interesting idea. And then I think there's a gap in this literature. And then I sort of have like these methods or skills and I'd like to contribute to like this particular literature. For that, I think it's like networking is, much more like refined. You sort of like read like a range of scholars and then you like in one sense attempt to like find gaps and like attempt to like, tell them that you can fill in these gaps. But then there's also the aspect of just interacting with maybe people who do, for instance, research. Like if, for instance, you're like an undergrad student, and then if you like interact with somebody who's like a little further ahead in terms of like, the academic pursuit, they'll probably give you like ideas that you necessarily did not think about, like because you're like at a much early stage in your career. And I think that's something that I actively did, even though I wasn't thinking about it like as networking. I think it's like during like my when I was like doing my bachelor's or like my master's, I always had like seniors who were like doing their PhD, and then they would like organize like these classes or like these seminars, and I would go for them and then actively discuss with them in terms of like methods. And I would build the kind of friendships with like people who were like a little senior to me. And then when I started writing my proposal, I would initially submit my proposal to them. They would come back and give me like those corrections. I think you have like that sort of like a formalized system in a, university like LSE, where it's like I'm like as a teacher paid to like do that for like the undergrad students. But if, for instance, like, we didn't really have that sort of like an opportunity in India. So it's like informally you can actually do that. Where usually I think it's like PhD students are like quite welcoming of, in one sense, mentoring like junior students. So I think it's like you can informally as well do that networking and then sort of approach professors as well.
I think there are many opportunities within research and even after research.
Yeah.
People could go and stay in the field of research, in academia, or perhaps branch out more into the private sector or other opportunities.
Yeah.
If you don't mind sharing, of course.
Yeah.
Would you mind telling us what the future looks like for yourself? What would you like to do?
I think it's like I've always wanted to be like in academia, but then I think it's like the prospects of being in academia is like so competitive. So I'm, in one sense, it's like open to like looking at like policy and like allied institutions. I think especially if you're in London, like there are many opportunities that you can look out for. I think one of the things that I sort of did was like there were internships at the ministries that the UK government itself has. Like, for instance, like I actually applied for like a placement, not necessarily internship, a placement with the Home Ministry here in the UK. And I think that's something that like the British, students can actually look out for. So I did get through the internship, but then I think it's like you had to have lived in the UK for like 5 years to then, actually do the placement. because it's like a civil service kind of like a position. So some of the work that the Home Office did in terms of like migration, in terms of border control, even though if I'm from India, I think it's like because I do history and I'm very familiar with like Ministry of External Affairs and Ministry of like Home Affairs. And these are like, what do you say, structures that are like similar in India, even though we in one sense like borrowed from the British, like the governance structures. So I sort of approached like, what do you say, the home ministry, saying that, it's like I kind of sort of know this because we have like a similar structures and I'm very familiar with the archives in India. But then there's these questions of like being a citizen to like in one sense participate, what do you say, within like the civil service in the UK. But I do think it's something that the British, if you're like from Britain, that's something that if you're like in research and social science, you can look out for like the ministries. And I also feel it's not necessarily just the ministries. For instance, I also got the opportunity because of LSE funding to like do archival work in the US. So, it's like, I think it's like as a researcher, you need to like be actively looking out for like opportunities, not necessarily just in terms of like doing your PhD, because sometimes it's like you could be like doing your PhD and it becomes like pretty monotonous. And then you need to like look for like other opportunities. So yeah, I think it's like there are like a lot of opportunities, especially because it's like London, you have like all these ministries. If you're like in social science, there are so many, NGOs and policy organizations that do the sort of work. And oftentimes, even if you're not exactly from Britain, there are ways in which you can frame your research that will be like resonant for like the British policy organizations. So yeah, I think it's like...
Nice. You also mentioned that you mentor students, and that must be quite fulfilling.
I sort of initially took it up because it was sort of important, like for my CV to have like taught like this course if I need to then like apply for a job. But then once I actually began doing that, it's something that I like really enjoy because the students that I'm in one sense mentoring, they're like actually actively interested in what I'm teaching. And oftentimes it's like they actually read the whole readings and come back. And I do learn like a lot of things from the students themselves. And so it's quite like an enriching experience that way. So I think it's like it's a mentorship, but also because I'm like a junior member of staff, I do learn like a lot of things from my students as well. Yeah.
So to comment on the networking part, I don't know if it's inherently part of Indian culture or South Asian culture, but it's interesting. You said like you weren't consciously thinking about it. You kind of just did it. And I really was very impressed. And I learned a lot at the UN in the Asian headquarters from mainly Indian colleagues who would start in one division, but then just every day I would see them. They'd be having a coffee with someone from another division, head of department here, director of this place, and they would literally just like within like 1 or 2 years have worked in like 4 different agencies or divisions, because it just seems like I know as a South Asian myself, we are quite outgoing to just speak to people. It's not really compared to some of the East Asian cultures where they're a bit more reserved.
Yeah.
We can just say, oh, you like, why don't you just send an email to that person, send a LinkedIn DM to them and just say, oh, do you want to have a coffee? And through doing that, once it becomes a habit, you won't even be thinking about it.
Yeah.
I think that we can all learn from the Desis when it comes to this, just not overthinking, approaching people for advice, reaching out to different types of people. And just really taking that approach. In the short term, you might get a job, you might learn a lot, but in the long term, I really think the opportunities are endless because you just never really know. I know one thing in our culture, we speak about kismet and destiny, but if you don't send that message or that email, you never know what the opportunities you could have missed out on. So,
one of my favorite phrases actually based on that is, if you don't ask, you don't get. If you ask, you might not get, but if you don't ask, you definitely won't get. So
definitely when it comes to all the Indians I know, they definitely ask all the time and they usually end up finding an answer. So Well, I think we've covered a lot today. So honestly, thank you so much, Noel, for sharing your insight into this. I really hope that people from whatever background have learned and taken some inspiration to follow in your footsteps and basically pursue their dreams. As cliche as it sounds, you've got a dream, keep persevering and you'll be able to find a way to achieve it. Any final words of inspiration to anyone watching this video?
I think it's like, especially if you want to pursue like research within social science, which is what like I sort of like did, I think the one thing that you need to have is like perseverance and like not doubt yourself. For instance, you did like one set of applications and then it's like that didn't work out. So I think the only thing that you sort of need like in the long run, because it's like oftentimes when you do research, it's like 4 years. And like the only quality that you often need is you don't need to be like that smart. You don't need to be like that of a genius. The point is like oftentimes when you do research, it's primarily like, are you like persevering something? And then it's like, are you able to persevere that for like a long time? So I think it's like for anybody who's like trying, I think the only thing that I have to like say is like, yeah, just persevere within that specific niche topic that you have. And then, yeah, I think the results will like come out inevitably.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Guys, thank you again for watching. If you found this useful, please give us a like and subscribe. Comment down below if you have any questions. We'll do our best to answer them, and we'll see you in the next one. Thank you very much.
Thank you.